Here in Japan, every winter for the past 29 years, KFC has been adding a winter-only chicken pot pie into their menu, and it's fucking delicious. And when I first saw it in 2019, I was walking by and saw an ad for it in the window. So I walked in and grabbed one, and it was pretty big for something like 590 yen. Then in 2020, they cut the size in half and marketed it as a more affordable size, dropping the price to 400 yen.
Excuse-me-massen.
Welcome to another episode of the Excuse-me-massen podcast. I'm your host, Saul, and today we're talking about something really simple: the massive price increases in Japan over the past 5-ish years. And yes, I know prices have been going up all over the world, but I don't live all over the world. I live here in Tokyo, so that's what I'll focus on. So for a while now, it's felt like every time I go to the supermarket or the konbini or even Amazon, I catch myself doing mental math like I'm Layman, like 82. It's 246. And I catch myself thinking, wait, wasn't that like half price the last time I bought one? Followed by, damn, if I get this one, I won't be able to get that one for a while. Followed by, you know what, it, I'll just wait. And then I just eventually give up. And then from there, I went down a rabbit hole, not as an economist, not as some finance YouTuber, just as a guy in Tokyo who's been doing a lot of double takes at prices these past few years. If you've been living in Japan for over 10 years, you'll likely remember the first price hike, which was when sales tax was bumped up from 5% to 8%. And I specifically remember worrying about it, but not feeling any meaningful impact at the time. Then the government bumped it up again from 8% to 10% in 2019 for everything except food for home use and certain newspapers. And those ones stayed at 8%. Then from there, the three big hits stacked on top of the fact that yen was already getting weaker. You know, first, COVID came in like Kid Yamamoto and just kneed the global supply chain in the face 4 seconds into round one. Then the Russia-Ukraine war blew up energy and food prices for everyone, everywhere. And on top of all that, you've got trade wars and tariffs, especially out of the US, adding extra cost and uncertainty into the system. Meanwhile, the yen had already started sliding again around 2021, 2022, mostly because other countries jacked up interest rates after COVID and Japan didn't. So in this episode, I want to walk through how people much smarter than me explain this stuff, mainly from a Japan point of view. I'm going to stick to what I found in research, and in between, I'll drop in my own stories from life here in Tokyo, especially as a parent. And I'm looking at you, Shake Flakes. First, we got to set the baseline though. If you've been in Japan for a while, or if you've heard people talk about the lost decades, you might know this already, but Japan used to be famous for prices that basically never moved. From the mid-90s up to the early 2020s, when global inflation kicked in, Japan was stuck in this weird combo of very low inflation and even straight up deflation. Bank of Japan summaries break it down roughly as about 15 years of actual deflation. Then another long stretch where inflation was still only around 0.5% on average. So for decades, they couldn't sustainably hit that 2% inflation target other countries were always talking about. Economists who look at the 2010s say Japan's inflation was basically drifting between 0 and 1% most years. So yeah, things felt pretty flat. And if you're a plebeian like me, all these dates and numbers might be putting you into Dave Chappelle mode like, what the is juice? I want some grape drink. It's purple. So basically, what that all means in human terms is, if you were here in those years, your brain was pretty much trained to assume prices don't and won't change. Ramen is ramen. Cup noodles are cup noodles. Your utilities might nudge around a bit, but nothing suddenly jumps 20 to 30% unless the consumption tax changes. So when prices suddenly do start moving, it doesn't just feel like, oh, inflation is 2 point something. It feels like the whole background setting of your life in Japan changed. I remember when I moved here in 2011, all the vending machines had their drinks either under, at, or slightly over 100 yen. Nowadays, the lowest prices I see on Tokyo vending machines is 120 yen for stuff like tiny bottles And then bottled water is very commonly at 150 or even 160 yen. And these companies try to justify the roughly 50% increase with like a big 600 ml written in bold, as if we're all walking around with the IQ of Sloth from the Goonies saying like, hey, you guys. And are you kidding me? Get the out of here. I mean, is what I'd say. But as parents, we suck it up and fork up the dough, all while these companies continue to dance around like, what you say, get money, you know? In the last couple of years, Japanese news started using this phrase a lot, which is neage rush or price hike rush. And once you notice that word, you start seeing it everywhere. Supermarket flyers, TV news, Yahoo headlines. Here's the part that surprised me when I looked it up. Japan's overall inflation has finally been hanging out in that 2 to 3% zone. In 2023, government stats say prices were about 3.2% higher than the year before. In 2024, they were up another 2.7%. And so far in 2025, core inflation has been hovering around the 3 to 4% range year on year. If you're listening from the US or Europe, those numbers might sound normal, but for Japan, after decades of near zero, that's a big mood shift. Then you zoom in on food and it gets more real. There's this credit research company known as Teikoku Databank that's been tracking how many processed food and drink items get price hikes each year. And their numbers are pretty wild. In 2022, 25,768 different products went up in price. And then in 2023, that number climbed to over 30,000 items. For 2025, their forecast is still about 20,000 plus items getting hikes. So when the news says price hike rush, it's not just vibes, there's a spreadsheet behind it. They also broke down July 2025 specifically. In that 1 month alone, 2,105 items were scheduled to get price hikes with an average jump of about 15%. Stuff like rice products, chocolate, chips, pasta sauce, coffee, the exact things we typically grab without even thinking. You also see stories about curry and rice as kind of signal foods, which is kind of a coincidence because just like 2 weeks to a month ago, my favorite curry restaurant, Koko Ichibanya, announced that they were raising their prices. And I was just there a few days ago. And luckily enough, that hike wasn't large enough to dissuade me from continuing to go there. But anyways, one report calculated that the cost of making a basic plate of home-made curry rice has climbed over the years into the low 400 range per serving compared to the mid 300s not too long ago. Wholesale rice prices hit a record high in 2024. One benchmark 60-kilogram bag was about 55% more expensive than the year before. The government ended up dipping into state rice reserves and even talking about imports just to cool things down a bit. And I remember this because it was all over the news, and the staff at my local supermarket were calling out to customers really loudly to get their state rice while supplies last. And of course, it's not only the tags going up, it's shrinkflation, smaller packages for the same price. Articles keep talking about 100 yen items quietly becoming 120 or 150 yen. Snack bags losing volume while the bag size stays the same. Chain restaurants nudging prices up while quietly cutting portion sizes. At the beginning of this episode, I said, I'm looking at you, Shake Flakes. And I said that because this one, along with some other stuff, got under my skin. Both of my daughters were OCD level picky with food when they were really small, to the point where they ate nothing but Shake Flakes, aka salmon flakes, and rice for breakfast, lunch, and even dinner. And it also had to be a specific brand and product. So we were buying the same thing every single day for years. When we first started buying it, it was under 400 yen for a jar. I want to say it was hanging around the 370 yen range. Then tax jumped and jumped again. And then COVID hit, and my wife and I noticed the jar was suddenly only 2/3 full when it was more like 90 to 95% full before that. And not just that, but the price jumped all the way up to over 700 yen. So we were getting around 30% less actual fish for almost double the price. Throw on the various other things we're going to talk about in this episode, and now, in 2025, the jar itself is 2/3 the original size, sitting at around 80% full, but the price is still higher than the original large jar that was 90% full. So yeah, neage rush. It's not just a clickbait phrase. The factual data and anecdotal evidence backs it up. And so the obvious question is, why now? Let's rewind to COVID. I know we're all tired of talking about it, but if we're trying to figure out why prices changed, we kind of have to start there. When the pandemic hit, it wrecked supply chains. Factories shut down, ports got clogged, containers were stuck in all the wrong places, shipping costs shot up. Japan's trade white papers talk about what happened when China locked down early on. Imports from China dropped sharply, which caused production headaches for Japanese companies that rely on Chinese parts and materials. JETRO, which is basically Japan's official trade and investment support agency, did surveys asking Japanese firms why they suddenly started rethinking their supply chains. And the top answers included disruption in international shipping, higher shipping costs, and being nervous about depending on just one country or region for key parts. When a company's parts and raw materials are delayed or more expensive, they can't realistically keep eating that extra cost forever. Japanese manufacturers pass some of that on as higher wholesale prices, and those eventually show up in what the supermarket or konbini charges us. Economists who look specifically at Japan's recent inflation say that from around 2021, a big part of the story was global commodity price hikes and bottlenecks, not some sudden explosion in local demand. In other words, the world got more expensive and Japan imports a lot of the world. And it's not just the supermarkets and konbinis either, as I already mentioned with the curry restaurant, but the same can be said with international fast food chains like KFC. Here in Japan, every winter for the past 29 years, KFC has been adding a winter-only chicken pot pie into their menu, and it's fucking delicious. And when I first saw it in 2019, I was walking by and saw an ad for it in the window. So I walked in and grabbed one, and it was pretty big for something like 590 yen. Then in 2020, they cut the size in half and marketed it as a more affordable size, dropping the price to 400 yen. But the price has constantly been rising with that same tiny size. Fast forward to now, I ate one last week and it's not only still half the size that it was in 2019, but it's also 470 yen now. So the easy way to think about it is that 590 yen pie from 2019 would basically cost you almost 1,000 yen today if it were the same size. And this is only 6 years, mind you. This is not like decades. So COVID threw off the global supply chain, and just when it was trying to limp back to normal, Russia invaded Ukraine. And if you live in Japan, that matters way more than the physical distance on a map, because Japan is extremely dependent on imported energy. The government's energy white papers put Japan's energy self-sufficiency at only around 12 to 13% in recent years. That means close to 90% of what we use here in Japan, oil, gas, coal, uranium, comes from overseas. In 2022, about 80+% of Japan's primary energy supply still came from fossil fuels, and roughly 2/3 to 70% of electricity was generated by thermal power, burning imported coal, oil, and natural gas. Before the Ukraine war, roughly 9% of Japan's liquefied natural gas imports, around 4% of crude oil, and about 11% of the coal used for power generation came from Russia. So Japan wasn't totally dependent on Russia, but it was a meaningful chunk. And when the war started, global prices for oil, LNG, and coal jumped. For a country that imports almost all of its fuel and still burns a ton of it for electricity, that's brutal. Analyses from around 2022 to 2023 were already warning that household energy costs, electricity, gas, kerosene, gasoline, were heading toward record levels. And unless the government poured in subsidies, a lot of families were going to feel real pain in their denki or electricity and gas bills. And then there's the food side. Higher crude oil prices push up costs for fertilizer, transport, and grains like wheat and corn that go into animal feed and processed foods. Japan imports a big chunk of its wheat and feed. So when global grain prices spike, you feel it in bread and pasta, noodles, meat and dairy because of feed costs, and all the processed foods build on top of that. Now, here's where the timing really makes it hurt. The war doesn't just make energy and grain expensive in dollars. Around the same time, starting in 2021 and really accelerating in 2022, the yen was already weakening. In 2020 to 2021, $1 equated to roughly 105 to 110 yen. By 2022, the annual average had jumped to about 130 yen per dollar. And since then, we've seen it flirting with the 150 to 155 yen range. So you've got higher prices in dollars because of the war and global markets. Plus, you need more yen to buy each of those dollars. It's basically a double tax on anything imported. And I can vouch for this information because my energy bills for gas, water, and power have increased by a load in the past few years. Of course, there are multiple factors at play, but considering how huge the jump is in cost on a month-to-month basis, the data that I've just given you adds up. All right, now the third layer of pain, which is the tariffs and trade wars. And I want to be super clear, I'm not pretending I've read every policy paper front to back. I'm mostly leaning on what economists and central banks have already dug into. On the US side, you've got economists tracking real-time prices across a huge set of products who looked at the 2018 tariff wave for things like 25% tariffs on steel, 10% on aluminum, and additional tariffs on a big basket of Chinese goods. Their conclusion was pretty brutal for the talking points. The tariffs were almost fully passed on into US import prices. In plain English, US importers and consumers ate the cost, not foreign exporters. Some studies estimate tens of billions of dollars in extra costs and a noticeable hit to US real income from those tariffs alone. Follow-up analyses and think tank work basically agree. Tariffs act like a tax, and a lot of that tax shows up in higher retail prices in the countries that impose them. Japan isn't the main character in that story, but we're definitely in the same universe. When the Bank of Japan does its big outlook reports, it has a whole section on downside risks. In that list, they literally mention things like escalation of trade friction, tariff measures, and other policies that can slow global growth and raise import prices for countries like Japan. So if global trade is slower, more expensive, and more unpredictable because of tariffs, export-heavy economies like Japan sell less abroad. Companies pay more to reroute supply chains or build backup factories. And in the end, most of those costs filter into what we in Japan pay for imported goods and for Japanese products that depend on imported materials. In the last few years, there have been new tariff rounds and tariff threats aimed at a wider range of goods, from EVs and batteries to steel to more categories in US-China trade that affect global supply chains Japan is plugged into. When you look at policy commentary out of Tokyo, you start seeing a lot more talk about economic security, resilient supply chains, Japanese companies investing overseas not just for growth, but to dodge tariff barriers and uncertainty. That's all extra cost in the system. Timing-wise, though, the big yen slide we're living through now really kicked off around 2022 because of interest rate gaps over COVID. Other central banks hiked hard and Japan stayed near zero. Tariffs and trade wars don't show up in the data as the button that crashed the yen, but they do add another layer of pressure and uncertainty on top of a currency that was already weakening. From my side, I can't sit here and say, this exact tariff equals 7 yen on your carton of milk. That would be bull. But when you zoom out, the pattern is tariffs make trade more expensive. They mess with supply chains and growth, and central banks, including Japan's, are explicitly listing this stuff as one of the risks behind the inflation we're feeling. So even if your supermarket receipt doesn't print a line that says tariff charge equals 38 yen, it's part of the bigger global mess that eventually shows up in your everyday prices. Whenever I have downtime, one of my favorite things to do is go on Amazon and window shop. And I recently was introduced to this app called Keepa, Keepa, not sponsored. And what Keepa does is it attaches a graph just under the pictures of the Amazon product page that you're looking at and shows the price history of that specific product, up to back when it was first added to Amazon's product catalog. It's intended to help sellers know what's the most effective price to sell at, but more importantly, it provides buyers with the necessary information for them to get the best prices. And zooming out to see older products' price histories, you can actually see how prices have continued to go up for practically everything. So now we've got this stack. COVID smashed supply chains and raised shipping and input costs. The Russia-Ukraine war blew up energy and grain prices and overlapped with the yen getting weaker. Trade wars and tariffs made global trade more expensive and more unpredictable. And all of that is sitting on top of a yen that was already weakening, first back when the Abenomics era, which is another story all on its own, and then again from 2021 to 2022 with the post-COVID rate gap. Right now, the yen's been chilling in that 150-ish per US dollar neighborhood. Right now, actually today, I think it's like 155 or 156. And in dollar terms, Japan has slid a long way down the global ranks. One Piece pointed out, and not the anime One Piece, and no, not the dress meaning for One Piece. Sorry, let me step back. One article pointed out that since around 2000, Japan has gone from being near the top, like third in the world in GDP per capita in dollar terms, down to somewhere around the high 30s today. Some of that is slow growth, but a lot of it is simply the yen being weak. And an import-heavy country with a weak currency is like playing life on hard mode. Every barrel of oil, every shipment of LNG, every container of wheat, coffee, or beef costs more in yen just because your currency buys less even before you add war and shipping drama. Food inflation in Japan has often been running hotter than the overall number, which is the mid to high single digits at times. That's why you keep seeing stories about cheap sushi chains raising prices, 100 yen shops having 100 to 20 or 150 yen zones, family restaurants trimming menus or quietly shrinking portions. Izakaya have been getting hammered too. Teikoku Databank's numbers show that in 2024, 203 izakaya operators went bankrupt between January and November, more than the 189 that went under in 2020 at the height of the first COVID wave. It's the highest figure in over a decade. And if you look at household spending, you see people reacting. There are months where household spending is down compared to the previous year, even though prices are up. So people aren't magically earning more, they're just buying less to cope. Or rather, we're buying less to cope. Bikuri Donkey, one of the only family restaurant chains I can actually say I like. Their Donkey House beer is sweet, bro. It's good. It's good. But yeah, before all this craziness, their menu was legit. A lot of different stuff. My go-to was the cheese-in hamburger steak with curry and that salad that had the almonds in it. And sometimes the spaghetti with meat sauce. Man, as a dad with little ones, perfecto. But their menu is so slimmed down to practically just hamburger steaks with all kinds of sides. Anyways, to be fair, it's not like Japan is the only country dealing with this. From around 2021 onward, a lot of developed countries saw big inflation spikes because of the same combo: COVID aftermath, the Ukraine war, energy shocks, and the global supply chain mess. If you peek into international personal finance or economics content online, you'll see people in the US and Europe complaining about grocery bills hitting 4 figures a month, energy bills doubling or tripling, rents moving faster than wages. But Japan's situation has its own twist. We had decades of almost no inflation, so any change feels huge. We're unusually dependent on imported energy and food. The yen's big slide happened at basically the worst possible time, right when those global shocks hit. So even if our headline inflation number isn't as high as some Western countries, for people who've lived here a long time, it feels like the comfort we've enjoyed as though Japan equals stable prices kind of just broke. So to bring it home, here's how I'd summarize it. Japan spent years in this flat price world. Then COVID wrecked supply chains and quietly pushed up costs. The Russia-Ukraine war spiked energy and grain prices and overlapped with a weakening yen. Trade wars and tariffs layered extra friction and cost onto global trade. The yen was already weakening through all of this, which turned those global problems into bigger price hikes here. And all of that eventually shows up on the shelf at Aeon or in your konbini bento. I'm not here to say this is exactly how global economics works, 100% confirmed. I'm just connecting the dots from what researchers and the Bank of Japan are saying and lining that up with the feeling we all have when we tap our Suica cards or open our wallets lately. So I want to hear from you. If you live in Japan or are an obsessed repeat visitor like many of us are, what was the first thing where you thought, okay, this has officially gotten too expensive? If you're listening from overseas, does this sound similar to your situation or totally different? Drop a comment, DM me on Instagram or Threads at @XQS_podcast, or hit the contact form on the site and let me know what everyday prices look like where you are. The economists at the Bank of Japan think inflation might hover somewhere around that 2-ish% range in the medium term, but even they admit there's a lot of uncertainty. Wars, tariffs, energy, currency, there are still a lot of dice in the air. In the meantime, we're all just here trying to live our lives, buy groceries, and not cry at the self-checkout. If this helped make sense of the madness even a little bit, consider following the show on your favorite podcast platform, giving us a star rating, leaving a review, or sharing it with a friend living in Japan or planning to come here. As always, excuse me, Massen, and see you.